I don't know how it is here because the stupid arguments that we have here, but the stuff there is very different than it is here. They know how important it is, man, for the zjednання to occur. Now, once you've heard this, you're waiting for that last wave. That's the Thermidor wave. That's the revolutionary wave. Is it happening in Ukraine? Well, I can say this much. We know of the examples of the sixth wave, the independence wave. It has arrived. How do we know it has arrived? Because you listen to the programs that start appearing in January of 1989. First, you hear Набока and Milowski's група, Українська демократична спілка. Not Westerners, but Easterners. Their program is to discuss the question of sovereignty in Ukraine. Guess what date they pick this year? They picked, for their conference, they picked January 22nd and January 23rd to discuss the issue of where Ukraine has to head. Now, it's interesting, Українська демократична спілка is not allowed to have that конференція, but the студенти Києва take the initiative at that time, knowing that наші студенти вмерли під крутами. What you start seeing is they go to the цвинтар, де наші поховані є, синьо-жовті прапори і тризуби. Але не в Львові, в Києві. І не в справі Галицької армії, а в справі наших студентів під крутами. Українська гетьманська демократична спілка isn't allowed to, but I can tell you who is allowed to. Виходить на Галичині Український християнський демократичний фронт. І перший принцип, this is a February document, перший принцип Українського християнського демократичного фронту є самостійність України. Now that's why this information is very important, folks. Because this information doesn't get everywhere. We really have a problem in the West, more than we do in the East. Because Василь Щічко, що творить той християнський демократичний фронт, не тільки творить, he doesn't just create this front, but what he establishes in the program of the front is that we renew all the organizations that were in the Ukraine before 39. Folks, I am happy to report today, and if you want to, I've got the reports right here. I am happy to report to you today, there is a plast in Ukraine. Not only is there a plast in Ukraine, but when Щічко has brought back given us back the information, this plast is no longer called Курені. Пласт тепер є побазований на сотнях. Це військове слово. And you wouldn't believe the names of the sotny that are coming out of there. You see those Ukrainian flags that you've seen in Moscow flying around? That's our plastuni running around. Do you know what the sotny are called? The мужицька сотня, the male sotnya, is called Sotня в імені Герою УПА. А жіноча сотня називається Сотня імені Ольги Басараб. All right? Now, what's interesting about this is at the same time that that's developed now in our lands, what we find is even the other movements. The other movements have gone so far that they get together in Vilnius in March of 1989, and they sign two zаяви. One is a zayava do російської інтелігенції, and it says, why don't you just simply let us go? And 10 of the national groupings signed that zayava. And then there's the Charter Svobode, the Charter Svobode, the Charter of Freedom, signed by Makar and Hrycaj, again in Vilnius, that simply states, the empire must go, we must all nations inside the Soviet Union must be free. But all of that, we might say these are different groups. But remember how I started the 50s and the 60s, and I told you that there was a symbol to all of this. there's one guy who's a symbol to all of this. The guy who started the New Age. And we don't know what's going to happen to him because there's a lot of disinformation now coming back to us. But he can't bury, or they can't bury, it's not he can't bury, but they can't bury what he wrote. When he was in exile in December of 1988, January of 1989, he wrote an enormously insignificant political theoretical piece. And in that piece, he states very clearly what our program should be. And the first principle is nizalezhnost, and the guy's name is Levko Lukyanenko, the head of the executive committee of Української Спілки. Що далі? All you have to know in terms of the basic намір твоєї праці is, its focus is не пора москалеві ляхові служить. And that's how the centerpiece of the words that he uses. Now it's interesting. We have come to the sixth wave. We have come to the point where samostinность is an issue that's being brought up in Ukraine at this point. We have come to the position I don't have to tell you, you've seen it on TVs. Did you ever think that you were going to see the day that you were going to see синьо-жовті прапори, not even in Kyiv, Lvovі, but where are you seeing it? You've got videotapes of it. Believe your eyes when you see it. Синьо-жовті прапори де? В Москві. It's happening. It's happening. Its potential meaning, I'm going to say potential meaning because it hasn't actualized yet, is important for us. Because what does this mean at this particular point? I would say, man, that there are ways of looking at the potential meaning. This is the last section that I'm going to deal with, the analysis. Think of this latest відродження, то є наше п'яте. Було УНР, українізація, ОУН, УПА, 60-ті роки, а тепер нове відродження. Це відродження є найскорше всіх відроджень. Перший пункт. Але чому? Remember, there's a professor, man, that everybody called the Trotskyite, but I happen to particularly like him even though I'm a Banderite. His name is Kravchenko, and he's a very interesting character. In his book about social consciousness and national change in the 20th century Ukraine, he makes a very interesting point, and maybe that's why the Vidrodzhenia is as quick as it is. We always thought, man, that the backbone of our nation had to have been the peasantry in the background. We have now learned that it is quite possible that if we Ukrainianize the cities, and that's why perhaps the Vidrodzhenia is as quick, as rapid as it is, if you Ukrainianize the cities, which is what modernization has done for us, for the first time Ukrainians have flooded the cities, for the first time we have Ukrainian cities. Remember, we didn't even have Ukrainian cities during OUN, UPA. Lviv was not a Ukrainian city, it was a Polish city. Today, we have a 1 million-person city that's fully Ukrainian. But remember, urban masses are well-educated. They have access to communication. They have access to mass action and so on and so forth. That's the difference. That's one difference. And why the potential meaning of this Vidrodzhenia is not simply a Vidrodzhenia, a dovershenia. Because one, we have modernized, and there are modern ukes out there. And they're not the dumb sort of, the hillbillies out in the woods and stuff like that. They are modern, urbanized, well-educated. First, that's why the Vidrodzhenia так во. Second, ідеологічно вони вже багато далі, нині вже багато далі стоять, як два з тих відроджень. Українізація ніколи не дійшла до дебати про самостійність. І 60-ті роки ніколи, 20-ті роки ніколи не дійшли українізації, і 60-ті роки ніколи до повної ідеї дебати про самостійність не дійшли. So ми вже далі є, як два з тих відроджень. Я би сказав, що ми є навіть далі, рукою на серце, ОУН, УПА, то є герої, фундація всього нашого модерного буття. Але ОУН, УПА, більша частина її боротьби була на Західній Україні. Нині те відродження відзеркалюється по цілих всіх частинах України. Дуже важне є. І ті дебати між православними і католиками тепер вже жодного сенсу не мають. Тому є далі, може, і глибше навіть можна сказати, як ОУН, УПА. Я би навіть сказав нині, дальше і глибше, то, що може потенціально дітися на Україні нині, є дальше і глибше. Or should I go back to the English language? It's deeper and clearer for us that it may be greater than what happened during the Ukrainian National Revolution in 1917 and 1923. Why? Because we're better known. If nothing else, Chernobyl blowing up, nobody asks the question of where Ukraine is today. All these crazy Demjanjuk cases and Medved cases and Chernobyl cases, we're on the front page. No, people don't ask you who the Ukrainian is. In 1917, they would still ask you that question. In 1941, they would still ask you that question. In 1965, they would ask you that question. They don't ask you that question today. So again, far greater potential. But even more important than that is, folks, it's you. 4 million people in the immigration. And think of it, you're scattered everywhere. You're in Poland, you're in Czechoslovakia, you're in Yugoslavia, you're in Germany, Belgium, France, England, you're in Canada, you're in the United States, you're in Brazil, you're in Venezuela, you're in Argentina, you're in Australia. You're all over the place. You've got wealth. You've got education. Ми то не мали в 17-му році, і ми навіть не мали в 39-му і 41-му році. We have it today. They can't mess with us today. But most of all, the potential meaning can be different, that this is not only a відродження, але довершення, that we can actually gain самостійність this time around if you don't blow it in this immigration of yours, is the fact that there are 26 nations that sit under that yoke. You ever go to one of these ABN meetings and you meet everybody from every part of the world? Angola, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, South Yemen, and so on and so forth, right down to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and so on and so forth. The big bear has just chewed too much. He's got to regurgitate this stuff. There are too many people that don't like him. And remember, one of them has done something extraordinarily important. The Russian Empire, every time it's lost a war, it's seen a revolution. After the Crimean War, it had to free the serfs. After 1905, it had to give Duma. After 1917, it had the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1941, it nearly lost the war. It got saved by the Siberian divisions out of the Siberian steppes. Today, it has lost in Afghanistan. Its army is demoralized. 13 republics rise, and there is no way they can shut that thing down. So, if that's the case, that all of this potentially means that we can reach that level of independence, that we really can actually make it onto the horse, and like good Kuzake, finally get to the Zaporizhzhia Sich. We can finally do it. What's stopping us? What's stopping us? Why isn't it gotten an actual meaning instead of a potential meaning? And I'll tell you 3 of the great horsemen. The 4th is ourselves, our own fears, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The first 3 are this. You've got to remember that the Americans don't particularly like, I'm going to be very blunt, they may not let me across back in there, I don't care, I was born there, let them sue me. American politics is a strange form of politics. You've got to remember they benefit from a bipolar world in which they and the Ruskies are the only players in the world and they control the rest of the world. The Americans aren't too crazy about you crazy Ukrainians changing the map of the world. First. 2, you know the Soviets aren't too crazy about you guys changing the map of the world either. But 3, and this is найбільша гангрена. То є найбільша гангрена, and I'll say it on camera. Найбільша гангрена є внутрішня опозиція між нами, що нам говорить, hey, it's time to slow down. It's time to do перший і другий універсал, як ми вже доходимо до 4-го універсалу. Now we can have a lot of debates about it. Tactica, tactica, tactica. Україна так, tactica. But no one out here in the West has the right to talk about anything but самостійність. You don't have a gun to your head. You don't have a gun to your head. And what's wrong with you, man? What's wrong with you? Do you think you're less of someone than they are? Why is it that of the people in the конференція that we heard in Paris, жиди були готові стати за самостійність у всіх народів. Москалі демократи були готові стати. Всі інші народи в Парижу в тій останній конференції, що було створено в Парижу в кінці травня, були готові стати. А наші люди були люди між нашими людьми, що казали, ні, ми не можемо до самостійності, ми мусимо бавитися конфедерацію і федерацію. Now, isn't it bad enough that we have the зовнішні вороги, американи і большевики, who don't particularly like us? But we can't afford to be divided on the issue internally. We can't afford, and we can allow Ukraine to do whatever it wants to, it needs to. If it wants to talk whatever language it wants to, it will. And you want to know something? What we found is they don't talk самостійність or конфедерація. They talk concrete steps towards суверенність. So they take concrete steps towards рідна мова, децентралізація економії, децентралізація політики, адміністративного бюро, українізація військових частин. They talk concrete. They don't want to get involved in the confederation самостійність debate. You know where that crap is coming from? It's coming from out here. Someone out here is feeding those poor friends of ours, brothers of ours in Ukraine, the line that the Americans won't approve if you go самостійне. Well, you want to know something what I think of the Americans? I don't care if they approve. It's not their business to approve or disapprove. It is not the business of the Russians to approve or disapprove, because they've got to realize the world is changing very rapidly. New superpowers are emerging. Europe will emerge, China will emerge, Japan will emerge. The Russians and the Americans are hanging on to each other. That's where you got the little American Soviet friendship flags all over the place. They're hanging on to each other because they know their time has come. Now, let's not get fooled by that. Not when на Україні, in effect, на Україні вже дійшло до такого, що дебата тепер твориться про самостійництво на Україні. Де ми мусимо підпирати, є вповні підпирати їх самостійницькі погляди. If they want to take a different tactic, that's their business. But we have no right, man, to sell anything less than that to the American world or the Western world in general. The Canadians, the Americans, the Western Europeans. If we do, you want to know something? They won't respect us. I've watched it in Washington. When we've come there, and the way Americans deal with us and the way they deal with our внутрішня опозиція when it comes down. To us, they try to explain it all over the place, and they're apologetic. To them, they condescend to them. But of course you would condescend to somebody who would tell you only want half the pie. I mean, what is it with our nation? That's the only thing, that's the fourth horseman, folks, and it's amongst you folks. It's not even amongst внутрішню опозицію, мінниківці, двікарі. It's amongst the people that believe in Vyzvolny front, that have carried the idea from 1900 to the year 2000, hopefully, and so on and so forth. It's amongst you. You've got to start believing that the time has come. You've got to start believing that it is here and now, and if your generation loses it, remember, if your generation loses it, it's all over. There won't even be nuclear ash next time. It's your responsibility. You've got to get on the horse. All right. Чи є якісь питання? Прошу.
History, if you look at this being Calgary.
Yeah.
Asked Paula last year. When Lenin started the Bolshevik Revolution, he started from the outside and brought it to the inside. That happened throughout history. In the West Indies, the same thing, brought from the outside to the inside. Can that be, those kind of tactics be turned around and used for Ukraine? Why can't, I mean, we've got the people, we've got the knowledge. People like yourselves in New York who know what to do.
Oh, it's all over the place. All of you have got knowledge. The thing has been that if you look at history, someone's trying to sell you something. I'm going to do about Soviet disinformation tomorrow. I'll tell you, man, you've got to remember, man, that there's a book out by Romerstein that's called KGB and the main enemy. And he calls the main enemy United States of America. I don't think the main enemy is the United States of America. Though in this book he calls line PR is the immigrant line, and we're the biggest division in there, the Ukrainians are. I honestly believe that the major enemy for the Soviet Union out here is not the Americans, because they always waffle. They don't know which way they're going. Nor is the Canadian government or the British government, French government, German government, or anything else. I think that the major enemy is us. And I will show you, if you want to read a State Department and... Why don't I do that? I should actually read a State Department CIA report that was put out about how they work with the Estonian situation, the Estonian immigrant organizations, because they know how important the Estonians are. 4 ways, folks. Afterwards, man, if someone wants to see it, you can read it. The first way is this. Soviet disinformation works by attempting to discredit you in front of your host governments. Now, how do we know they've done that? Give me an example. I'll give you an example. Fascist collaboration. They've embarrassed us in front of our host nations. That was the first way they did it. The second way they do it, the second thing he says as an example, he talks about the example of the Estonians. The second way they do it is by breaking up organizations. Now, you folks, man, have seen it. UKK and UNOKRADA, man, we've been broken up in America. Why were we ineffective on the Demjanjuk case and Medved and so on? We didn't have one organization. You guys have KUK. We don't have KUK. We don't have a KUK-like organization. We're splintered. It nearly happened with us in SKVU. Remember, the young. I don't care whether they are Milnikiewicz, Brniewicz, or anything else. Don't break up any of these organizations, because that's what the enemy wants. They want us to break the organization. That's point number 2. Point number 3 is the mistrust that the Bolsheviks in their disinformation campaigns create between Provid and Masse, between our leading members and the people. You know, always the bitching from the ranks, это что-то человек знает, yeah. Четвертое, and this is the 4th, is you folks. Because the Estonians found out it's you folks that are important, because what the Soviets particularly love to culture, what they love to ripen for their own benefit, are youth born in the West who have not seen the Soviet Union and might not necessarily be as anti-communist as their parents are. You folks are the ones they're going to work on. They'll send you scholarships for Ukrainian, they'll do all sorts of weird, wonderful things for you. They'll try to ship you back home. They'll try to get you into dance groups, and we'll do dance, and they'll do dance, and we'll all be dancing all over the place. I'm telling you, it's going on, and what it does is the 4 million strong, and we've got a higher level of education than most ethnic groups. We've got more doctors. Every 3rd person who is a doctor. Why we need so much medicine? I mean, we're not that sick. The fact is, man, we have an enormous amount of power. Bolsheviks know is, now we can get back to your point. The Bolsheviks know very full well that the Israelis didn't exist before '48. That when the Jews wanted their homeland back, they wanted to create a state, they literally had to do it from the immigratia and come back on that klaptik zemlyi and recreate the state from the immigratia. That's a very good example of how the immigratia won. But nobody remembers, or few remember, that Польська революція національна 19-20 року то була галера армія з Франції, що приїхала і допомогла Пілсудському здобути вільну Польщу. І так само ніхто не пам'ятає, що то Калленс був в Америці, що піддавав гроші айришам, щоб Ірландію здобути в 20-х і 30-х роках. So when someone tells you a bunch of bull, that immigrants can't do it, that person, you take them by the head and boom, to the, a couple of times, do what you'd like to do to a couple of your relatives, man.
No, it's got to be inside. We have to put it inside. Okay, it will, but what you said.
That's the great lie, that the immigrants can't do it. They want to split us from Kraj. They will do every possible attempt. They will attempt to split us, Церква в краю from us, і православну, і католицьку. They might even legalize it there, but they'll say, православна церква не може підлягати, українська православна церква, ми зробимо в секцію при російській православній церкві, чи може при якійсь іншій, але щоб вона там була, щоб вона не прилягала до імміграції. Українська католицька церква, ми створимо Українську католицьку церкву, вона буде називатися греко-католицька там, не буде української католицької, і буде підлягати полякам чи литовцям і so on, щоб тільки, не дай Боже, у нас з українцями мало щось спільного з імміграцією. They are scared of you. You know why? Think of it, man. You've done the history. After, you know, one of the things I didn't mention during the 60s is the burning of our great library. They burnt 640,000 pieces of our history, man, in the great burning of the library in 1964. And they said it was a bandit that did it. Baloney bandit. Був кагібіст, що спалив в 64-му році всі наші архіви з УНРу і всього іншого, що ми мали. I mean, this guy спалив the whole 100 yards, our national history. Одинокі речі, що залишилися, що є правдиво для нас важні, то є ті речі, що тепер ми маємо в НТШ, у Вані, то, що ви тепер Кравченко старається тут зібрати, то, що в Кальгарі тепер старається зібрати. Ті речі є тут на Заході. Watch, guys. Your eyes have to be open. I was going to warn you tomorrow, but be warned even today. The archives that are out here are extremely valuable. You know we don't have a security system on a single one of them. You know they could burn our archives like this out here. You've got to be careful. You've got to understand we're in a war. Whether you like it or not, you've been in a war. What do you think Demjanjuk was? It nearly broke your backs, folks. You were in the worst of all psychological warfare. They wanted to convince you that your fathers, your mothers, your grandfathers, your uncles and aunts were all Nazi collaborators and you weren't worth diddly squat. And they almost did it to you. They almost broke your back because they knew something might happen. But we're not, hey, we took 7 to 10 million in the famine. We got hit with польська пасифікація. We got hit with the пасифікація по Другій світовій війні. We've gotten hit with so much. Наш народ вміє терпіти, man. That's one thing, що навчився. Терпіти навчився перфектно. Hey, last it out, last it out. Get over that emotion. Last over the emotion of being hit all the time. Get over that emotion and finally come back and boom a couple of times to the wall. You know? I'm not going to do the chauvinist thing. I'm going to disclaim the chauvinist thing. We should do what Rome did to Carthage, you know? Level it and throw salt so nothing ever grows. No, the chauvinist, I agree, it's chauvinist. Anyway, did I answer?
Yeah, always like, let's do it now.
Let's do it. That's it. Well, it's interesting and stuff like that. Folks, these groups are very, very important. The ones that I mentioned today and the names I mentioned today, these are people that you've got to continue following. When I talk about Християнський демократичний рух in Shishko, he's for real. Plast is for real. If there are plastune here and they plan to be, and remember, I'm not saying you can't go as tourists in Ukraine. That's one thing you should be doing. You should go as legal tourists in Ukraine, and you know what? Every one of you, man, take a Plast uniform. Even if you don't belong to Plast, take a Plast uniform and leave it there. They can't take it away from you as you bring it in because it's yours. Hey, man, this is my uniform. I wear this. So that's the approach you've got to take. If you don't take that approach, you got to go in there. Hey, some of you go in full blue. Some of you go in full yellow, man, yellow jumpers and stuff like that. You trade places, man, you get up in front of Kanyu and заспівати ще на Metal Ukraine. I got better news for you. If you've ever seen Любомир Личук, you probably all know him. I'm going to be able to tell you this. Любомир Личук and Stefan Cipolyak, and they told me, man, we can say out. If you've ever noticed this Cipolyak, he's nuts too. Those two nutcases got together in Kharkiv, got drunk and so on and so forth, and at 3 in the morning, they phone up to Canada and start singing from Kharkiv, «Ще не вмерла Україна». You got to be merry pranksters. Folks, man, we've got to... Look, we're slicker. Did you ever notice the Muscovites? They look like they've been beaten by Brezhnev and Stalin. You know, we've been born in the West. We can out-slick these bozos. What we've got to do is just believe in ourselves. Тут віра є фундація. Знаєте, я тут дав ту доповідь, я дуже серйозно і по-українськи дав ту доповідь із оцем Романюком. Я взяв ту доповідь, перейшов то, і такий пункт за пунктом, я без жартів, без того, дуже формально, перед старими то дав ту доповідь. А отець Романюк сказав, я не хочу говорити те, що означає Zaryckyj, друг Zaryckyj говорив, я хочу тільки вам сказати про віру і фундацію вашої віри. And then він починає говорити про Хмельницького, Мазепу, Петлюру, Бандеру. And suddenly він каже ту глибоку віру тих людей. І що як через генерації нас нищуть, а ми, значить, все відроджуємося. Нас не може ворог знищити. Тому що є та глибока віра, вона є така, наша національна віра, то є вироблена та як релігійна віра. І вона більше глибоко може нині, як коли-небудь було, тому що я думаю, що є частина вас, що тепер нині більше віри, як колись-небудь вірили. Але так само є недовір'я часами. І до себе, і до своїх друзів. Ви не вірите, що є вас 60 мільйонів на світі. Ви направду в то не вірите. Якби ви зрозуміли, що 60 мільйонів значить в тім світі, завтра би ми мали державу. Серйозно. It really is just that simple. I can't put it any more clearly. All right. Anyway, хтось інший має питання? Прошу.
Isn't the main reason that they're giving so much freedom into Latvia, Estonia, and those Baltic countries that is that because they're small and it wouldn't matter to them anyways, and if they did, they need badly needed American dollars that would fund, that would come in on it. They can give those Baltic countries away for nothing, but it's Ukraine they're worried about.
That's true, but there's also, that is the basic truth. It's the economic truth, it's the basic truth. But you've got to start a campaign here in Canada the same way we are starting a campaign in the United States. I'll show you stuff that we've gotten for people who want to repeal this. There's a directive in the National Security Council. When the Security Council was very young in 47, 48, they did a directive in the United States in which they made it very specific what the policy of America is going to be, and they argued that that was going to be the policy of the West, which apparently applies to both Canada and England, that this is a joint policy. And their position was this. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they didn't mention the economics, which is, I think, where the base of all of this lies. But they simply said that these were historical nations that have shown that their capability of independence. Whereas with Ukraine, they said, and for that, they said that they will press the Soviets to give it back, ultimately if they get a chance to. In 1947, this was the position. With the Ukrainians, it was this. Their position was, the Ukrainians, 15 minutes left. Okay, I got you. I've been trying to fill in time, folks. Bro, I'm still shooting the ball. In effect, what they said about the Ukrainians is a two-edged sword. They said, the Ukrainians haven't shown that they're really a historical nation because they haven't been independent long enough. And so we really shouldn't be fighting. We may get the great Russians angry. At that time, they were still hoping that the Russian Democrats, somehow they were hoping some sort of Russian Democrats were running around doing this. And so their position was, we don't want to insult the great Russian nation, and we're not sure that the Ukrainian nation is fully separate and apart from the Russian nation. And so our position is going to be, we aren't going to back a Ukrainian state. We may back Ukrainian autonomy. Believe it or not, in '81, when we wrote the letter to them, asking, under Ronald Reagan, that was still the State Department position. The only addendum to it was, if the Ukrainians, however, prove themselves by going out there and kicking some Ruski butt, I'm paraphrasing now, obviously that was put in a slightly more legalese language, then we will reconsider the Ukrainian position. Then we will reconsider the Ukrainian position. In other words, man, what are they expecting us? We're going to launch nukes in the Soviet Soyuz, and then they'll reconsider a position? We're not quite sure what they mean by that. So our position is that the Baltijski narody, it's written into the American situation, into American foreign policy, and that's bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans, and I suspect it's the same way in the Canadian and British case, that the Balts are a separate situation from us. Вони інакші від нас. Ми мусимо то змінити. І ви так само мусите бажати, there are dangerous times for us ahead in terms of a lot of in this negotiation. You reminded me of something when you said Baltics. This Molotov-Ribbentrop stuff is not good for us, folks. We want to be like Sir Lord Bennett, or Sir Fred Bennett in the United Kingdom, who's asking that we return to the boundaries of December 1918. Грудня 1918 року. Чому ми мусимо вернутися до тих кордонів, а не до 39-го року? 39-й рік би для нас не був добрий. Якби ми вернулися до тих кордонів 39-го року, то балтійські народи, може би, пішли вільними, але для нас вони би відлучили то, що Сталін нам прилучив. Can you imagine? Тиран Сталін прилучив нам Західну Україну до Східної України, а тепер в тих часах, що має бути свобода, вони б нам відлучили. They would link away Western Ukraine and give it back to Poland. What were they going to do? They're going to give it back to Poland? Molotov, Ribbentrop, and that stuff that they're doing, the big stink, I mean, we can say we sympathize with the Balts, they should be free because of the basic principle, and because they were free from December 1920, when they signed the Dohovir of independence from Russia. But there are certain points that we can take up. Sometimes when you do black and ribbon and so on and so forth, tell the Balts, we'll do black ribbon with you because we think Molotov-Ribbentrop is bad news. But you also have to remember we're not that crazy about giving Western Ukraine back to the Poles. What we demand, and it would be fair to them, it would be fair to the Poles, it would be fair to the Balts, is if we demanded a free Europe December 1918. In fact, there's a campaign that's been started in England. We ought to spread it here, into Canada and the United States. December 1918 was the last time every single nation in Europe was free. Every single one. That's our campaign. A free Europe. Not free Eastern Europe, free Western Europe, but a free Europe. Ми до них зачисляємося. Я не думаю, що ми до Африки чи до Азії зачисляємося. Ну, а може Хвильовий казав, що ми є голова тої азіатської тої ренесансії. Прошу.
I was talking with Dr. Yuri Shibak in Vancouver
Yes,
when he
yes.
was there. And I had asked him this question. I want to know what your answer would be on this. What would happen, or if it would be a good idea if some of the youth got together and formed a branch of Zelensky Speak here in Canada?
It would be a very good idea.
He liked that idea.
It would be a very good idea.
Contact with them directly.
But you make contact with him. Remember, because щоб там не ховалося, because Yuri is a good guy. Він серйозно, він підходить, то він, значить, має з урядом свої стосунки, то, але він є мудрий хлоп. І зелений світ, але щоб тільки було зелений світ, а щоб вам не пересилали якихось таких інших совєтчиків, і щоб ховатися і казати, о так, ми друзі Юрія є. То треба дуже вважати з тим. Yeah. Someone else? Oh, прошу.
You touched on the ruch in Ukraine and how it's progressing, but can you just touch upon what effect, any changes in the Soviet hierarchy now or anything, what effect that would have on our ruch, or that law that they brought in about banning any demonstrations against the Soviet?
See, my attitude is that, and I was going to bring it out because I studied that Soviet active measures for a while. My attitude is that Gorbachev is the biggest lying sack of dung meat that this world. And it's based on thesis, on the thesis that Shlipakova put in something called a work called Andropov File, in which she claims, Ben, that Gorbachev is in fact a protege of Andropov. And that what Gorbachev and Andropov are all about is they don't believe in an ideology anymore. They don't have an ideology. They don't have capitalism, communism, democracy, Russian fascism, Russian nationalism, Russian Orthodox Church, religion. They don't have an ideology. They simply are the harbingers of what Orwell predicted in the 20s and 30s as the ultimate police state. You give Gorbachev someday the capability, the technological capability, and he will be able to control, with power, sheer power alone, without an ideological base, for centuries. You give a police state fax machines, informational capabilities, little PC computers. If you've ever crossed into Ukraine and you've seen at some of these crossings and so on and so forth, they don't have a computer. I mean, they just have it by hand. Now, think if they had a computer. What kind of activity could you go back and forth and so on and so forth? What kind of revolutionary activity could you ever engage in, or stuff can you get out when the police state would get that kind of technology? I'm really frightened of Gorbachev. Other people take him as a real populist, as a revolutionary, and so on and so forth. But if you've ever watched him, he's put laws in. These ukaze are extremely dangerous ukaze. if you ever watched him, he also happens to be centralizing power in his hands, and very deeply. And if you've ever watched him, in the last year, he has been quoted as saying, "I wish to diminish the power of the republics." And you know, there are creeps in the New York Times editorial page, I told Mikola that he's got to leave it in here, and he didn't leave it for me, who actually had the moxie to say that the nationalities question was something that Stalin exacerbated. Because Lenin understood that if he decentralizes and allows the nationalities to go the way they do, that it would be a disaster if they were too decentralized. It was Stalin, the Times is saying, it was Stalin's legacy, because as Minister of Nationalities, and that's what his position under Lenin was, as Minister of Nationalities, he gave the nationalities too much power, and now poor Gorbachev, man, has to deal with his irredentism. Irredentism. Frenzied mobs, frenzied nationalist mobs. There are people that are being sold this crap, and Gorbachev, man, has got to have an incredibly good psychological warfare division, man, in, you know, wherever it is, that can sell this stuff. He's really doing some really nasty stuff. And I personally don't believe a thing he says. You know, to me, he reminds me, I'm going to get religious about this, he reminds me of the false prophet. He reminds me of someone, man, who looks like he's telling the truth but is not. You know? And I know there are people, man, who are going to disagree with that position. Well, I don't, you know, but that's my opinion, folks, is that I think that Gorbachev may be ultimately more dangerous to the West than any single individual that has come out of the Soviet system. And if Shlipakova is right, he is the ultimate protege of Andropov, and Andropov was the ultimate KGB general. Andropov ran the KGB for 20 years and managed to do something that I didn't think, you know, old heavy-handed Khrushchev had to do Hungary the way he did. Old Brezhnev had to do Czechoslovakia the way he did. It was only with the artful dexterity of Andropov that Brezhnev, who was already a cripple by then, was able to do Poland the way he did. Notice, with Poland, the KGB learned you don't have to send in someone else's, your own army in there. What do? You send in your agents and make sure that the Zomo is well trained, and the Poles, who are extremely proud of their own nationality, what did they do in '81? When самі задусили. Now that can only be of the slickest form of political and psychological warfare and active measures. That you actually get the Poles on world stage to choke themselves, man, to shoot Zaryckyj, to shoot his own miners. Slick, slick. But Gorbachev is the protege of Andropov, folks. It's a very dangerous game. Now, that doesn't mean we can't out-slick him. The guy is just a doofy guy from southern Russia, you know. He's probably ate too many pigs in his life. We can out-slick him, but we've got to understand what he is. If at any point you have any question about it, if at any point you start believing that your opponent is not the slickest thing since Swiss cheese, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. If you start believing, 3 minutes left, I love it. If you start believing that he is anything else, you will fall into the trap and you will find yourself saying, but the guy is a reformer. He's not the reformer. If there's anything going on, it's that the reform, what he had to do, now has been taken a lot further than he actually expected it to go. The best example of Gorbachev that I can give, and that's where I'm going to end, is look at what Deng Xiaoping, the great reformer of China, did. Today, Deng Xiaoping, the great reformer, because the masses went too far, is now a reactionary pig who's about to crush the Chinese people. Gorbachev, at some point when it goes too far, is going to have to do it. What I'm worried about is that the West not give him the credits and the possibilities of having the technology to do it well. That's what I think about Gorbachev, folks.
Тепер почнемо про лагер. За підпілля не кінчили, почнемо про лагер.
Now we're going to be talking about the camps.
В перший лагер я попав, то в концлагери, на Заполяр'я, так як тут на Алясці.
The first camp that I ended up in was in an area much like Alaska or our Northwest.
Там ліс не росте,
There's no forest.
тундра, тільки такі кущики, береза, так може мати 100 років такої висоти, туди до Ледовитого океану.
Just tundra.
Це називалось місце Воркута. Ну, Воркута це не тільки місто, це такий велика площа, де лагери добували кам'яний вугіль.
This place was called Vorkuta.
В той час в лагерах знаходилось, за даними, ще КГБ поки що не відкрило кількість, але приблизно 30-40 мільйонів в'язнів.
There were approximately 30 to 40 million of these prisoners after the war in these camps.
Така кількість була до 1956 року, потім не була
There were that many till 1956.
амністія після смерті Сталіна вже.
Afterwards, there was an amnesty after several years after Stalin died, and most of the prisoners were released.
Лагери були такі великі, що було по 14 тисяч, 10. Ну, від 4.
Camps were so large that some of them exceeded 14,000 prisoners. Inmates.
Я попав в перший лагер, що було около 5 тисяч.
In my camp, there were 5,000 inmates.
Як привезли мене туди, як я попав в лагер, там тоді лагери такі були в лагерах Бараті, і в лагерах свій закон, своє життя. Тоді адміністрація не цікавилась, тобто як тепер порядком, що ти там робиш, чи тебе хтось